this country is at war with Germany.
We shall go on to the end.
I remember the sheets of flame which came up and almost blinded us from our guns.
In this episode of the World War II podcast, we're turning our attention to the opening phase of one of the most brutal and vast campaigns of the Second World War, Operation Barbarossa. On the 22nd of June 1941, Hitler launched his long-anticipated invasion of the Soviet Union. In the first 2 weeks, the German Wehrmacht made some of its fastest advances of the war. Panzer groups surged deep into Soviet territory, clashing with Russian armoured forces. Encounters that were sometimes unexpected and, for both sides, revealing. To explore this dramatic opening stage of the war in the East, I'm joined by Richard Hargreaves, author of Opening the Gates of Hell, which examines the speed, scale and the shock of Barbarossa's beginning. Richard, thanks for joining me. So it was at the end of 1940 that Hitler gave his order to begin planning for the invasion, and just 6 months later the attack went ahead. Considering the sheer size of the Soviet Union, the resources this campaign would demand, especially after the Wehrmacht had already been fighting in Poland, France, and the Luftwaffe had been engaged over Britain in the Battle of Britain, this doesn't seem much time to prepare. So the Germans already had a set of plans they could, dust off. How prepared was the German military for yet another campaign?
So basically, after France, we were talking days after signing the treaty at Compiègne, the German army, this is not Hitler himself, the German army is saying, let's look at Russia. Under the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, they've invaded Lithuania and Latvia and basically Estonia, taken advantage while we've been rumbling around in our tanks in France. They've taken advantage of that and just gone, we'll swipe these 3 countries all under the Pact. So it wasn't like it was illegal in that sense. Obviously, it's illegal to invade in 3 sovereign countries. But it sort of starts to crystallise in the mind of the German leadership that this pact thing, it might not be lasting that long. Initially, the plan is to start downgrading and shrinking the army, because obviously you beat all your enemies. And then within days of France ending, they're looking at increasing them in the army, and they're starting to look at plans for Russia. So it's the army starts sort of looking at East. It sort of ties in with Hitler's own thinking. And this is all taking place at the same time as they're drawing up plans for Sea Lion for the invasion of Britain. The two are side by side, and Hitler's thinking all the ways Britain is not surrendering because Russia's there and it's its last hope in Europe. I think that's the phrase he uses. The ideological element as well, because the 2 nations are literally ideological opposites, and there's going to be a clash one way or another sooner or later, and it's a question of who goes sooner. And it's Hitler who goes sooner, really, because I don't know, the Red Army's not ready. The Red Army thinks it's ready.
Well, that's an interesting question. The Red Army thinks it's ready. How ready is it? Because they had been rebuilding, and they have obviously fought that winter war with Finland, and there's nothing like a sort of a war to get you warmed up and point out where your problems lie with your own forces. So that spring of 1941, how ready for war was it?
I would describe the Red Army in 1941 as a force in transition. It's sort of starting to get the kit that it needs. It's starting to get the T-34s. It's got the KV-1s and KV-2s, the really heavy tanks, which, as it turns out, aren't that great. But it's also got a lot of legacy kit from the 30s that is, the Western campaign has shown that it's really outdated. And it's also starting to think about Panzer armies. So it creates these monstrous mechanized corps, which again are a force in transition, but it doesn't really know how to use them because it hasn't fought any wars using them. And also, it hasn't got the experience. The Germans have won in Poland, they've won in Norway and Denmark, France, Western Europe. They've just done the Balkans. So there's an aura of invincibility, as Gunter Blumentritt calls it, one of the senior officers doing the planning. The Red Army doesn't have that. It has this brutal campaign in Finland, which it sort of wins by sheer force of numbers in the end. There's a lot of stock taking after that. Stalin himself he addresses a load of officer cadets who finished their training in May 1941, around the same time as the parade. Obviously, the May Day parade in Russia is up there with the November one. It's the big showpiece. Look at all the tanks and machine we got. We are the strongest force in the world. Blah blah blah. And his address and his comments at this dinner for the officers in the Kremlin is very much, we're not as good as we look on paper. The next war's going to be very hard. But, and he basically says the war is coming with Germany. It's not going to be easy, but we will beat them.
When the Germans are starting to do that build-up, employing millions of men, this is an enormous force the Germans are mustering. How aware are the Soviets of the Germans' intentions? Because my assumption is there must be the Soviet army on those border regions must be aware that something's going on. Soviet intelligence can't be that blind to have not noticed that there's large movements of men, tanks and personnel, over the border.
There's reams of it. There's reports of deserters. There's reports from spies in the German high command. There's masses of material, as well as personal observations by attachés, guys on the frontier. So certainly by April 41, there's a very clear picture that there's Germans massing all along our frontier. So there's massive information flowing into the Soviet leadership from the intelligence services, from attachés, from embassies. There's no doubt that the Germans are building up all along the Soviet-German frontier. You just cannot hide it. And for me, you talked about how good is Soviet intelligence. I would say flip that over and say how bad is German intelligence. So I talked about the all invincibility. It looks across the border and it doesn't know much. It doesn't know how many tanks the Russians have. It doesn't know how big the Red Army is. It doesn't. It sort of knows where it's deployed, but it doesn't know entirely. It's ignoring the treaty on a daily basis and doing overflights of the border, but it's not going very far into Russia. So beyond that border strip, it's a bit of a here be dragons. The German army has a reputation in both world wars of being this super efficient, awesome machine that can conquer the world. Blah blah blah. But its intelligence is dreadful. It really doesn't know what it's going to. Hitler talks about kicking in the door and the whole thing will collapse. Well, A, that doesn't happen. But B, you kick down the door and you go, oh my God, what the hell are these T-34s? These are complete surprises to them. I would ask myself, what army invaded the country without knowing what military equipment the enemy's got? Well,
it's true. It occurred to me, you're looking at a border that you don't necessarily know how well defended it is, because you can't do those sort of, to make it a surprise, they can't do recon over the border to see what even the border defensive positions are like.
No. I'm not aware of any, or if there are, they're very limited sort of, what we call commando raids or intelligence gathering raids that we do these days. Trench raids as you would get in the First World War. There's a bit on the River Book where they're sort of, crawling up and down the river in boats and sort of observing and taking photographs. The odd swimmer will go across every now and then and they will do a little bit of digging around, but it's certainly not comprehensive. The German army sort of, like I say, it listens to radio intelligence and it sort of knows where the main forces are, but it doesn't really know how they're going to fight. It doesn't know what their instructions are. It doesn't know their sort of strength. And you see this time and again where, particularly as the campaign rolls on, you read Franz Holler's diary and he's going, there's another, X million troops suddenly appeared, or divisions have appeared out of nowhere, and they're constantly surprised all the way through the campaign, all the way up to Stalingrad, really, about the Russians' ability to mobilise people and produce material. So, German intelligence is very, very poor, and on the flip side, Soviet intelligence certainly has a good idea that there's an invasion coming, and they feed this all up to Stalin, who turns a blind eye to it. The blame for what happens in the opening weeks really rests with him. I doubt if they'd pulled troops back, there would have been much difference, because of the sheer weight of force in the opening days of the campaign. But it probably wouldn't have been as bloody and as dreadful as it was.
Those German troops that are going to be, at the sharp end of that opening couple of weeks, are they aware of what they're being tasked to do? Because it occurred to me that, there's over 3 million of them. And they must have some idea that, the First World War, Russia, they kind of were battering away. Napoleon has his problems, parallels there. But also I wondered, when you have so many men like that drawing up on the front, there's sort of an operational security. Are they even quite told what they're going to be doing? Are they sitting on the board thinking, well, I wonder how many men are to my left and to the right? Or do they?
Certainly at the ordinary German soldier level, they don't know. They probably are in the dark until 2 or 3 days before the attack. A lot of them guess, but there's a hell of a lot of rumours floating around. So a lot of them think that they might occupy Russia rather than invade. For example, Stalin might cede the Ukraine, or he might cede Russia. So there's quite a lot of that. There's also bizarre things about, say, marching through Russia to link up with Rommel. And there's all these weird rumours that are floating around. And the more sort of perceptive Germans look at the map of Europe and go, well, we've conquered this, and we've conquered all of Western Europe. There's only Russia left, so it's the obvious, this is what we're doing next. And ones who study the military history are concerned about the size and scale of Russia. They've read their Napoleon and First World War. They see the vastness of Russia. They know that it's never been conquered, and they are very, certainly on the divisional level, a lot of the divisional commanders are very, very sceptical about the invasion. Whether or not this filters down to the ordinary soldiers, probably not, because they don't want it to infect them.
Well, in some respects, it was pointed out to be Bob Fawcett pointed out, they're winners. They haven't lost 1939 and 40. There must be there's a confidence there from winning, from their point of view.
And certainly that definitely comes into the opening days of the campaign, where they sort of expect that, oh, look, there's a German, we'll just raise our hands. Particularly when they're also told that the Bolshevik regime is very unpopular. People hate the NKVD, the secret police, etc., etc. They're sort of expecting that the regime will totter and fall fairly quickly. So, like you say, as Hitler says, all you have to do is kick in the door and the whole rotten structure collapses. But it doesn't. Whilst there's evidence in the first few days, particularly army group centre battles in Minsk and Bialystok, the big pockets, that there is some crumbling going on. There's also some really fanatical, brutal fighting, which really surprises some of the more senior officers who really aren't expecting it to be quite that desperate. There's this guy called Heinrichi, who ends up being the last general defending the Eastern Front at Berlin at the end of the war. He's a corps commander, commanding an infantry corps. Thankfully, his letters and diaries have been preserved and transcribed, because his writing's horrendous. But he's one of the most perceptive leaders of the campaign, and he basically says within like a week of invading Russia, this is going to take hecatombs of corpses. He realises this isn't going to be a pushover, which is a realisation that doesn't creep into the high command probably for another 6 weeks or so. Never really leaves Hitler. He's always convinced that the next battle, the next offensive is going to knock the Russians out of the war. So
everyone's always looking for a decisive battle, and I'm not sure throughout the Second World War there were few and far between. So the Russians are aware of this build-up. They can hear rumblings and tank movements. Are they taking any anti-invasion measures? I mean, because the other thing to bear in mind is when they launched the Operation Barbarossa, it's the day after the summer solstice. It's one of the longest days of the year. So one would expect, if the Soviets are thinking about when might the Germans attack, let's just get things just on the off chance this could be a good time. Were they taking any anti-invasion measures?
In a word, no, not until the night of the invasion. There's a lot of calls for it. So the evidence is building up so much, particularly in the final days. There's deserters coming across. But every time the word comes back from the Soviet leadership, provocation, what they are desperate to avoid is provoking an attack. What they end up doing is neither provoking an attack nor being ready for one. So on the night of the invasion, most of the Soviet leaders are enjoying a night out at the opera or a theatre. So certainly the Pavlov, the commander of the Western Military District, he's in Minsk at a big sort of celebration. He's got sort of one eye on his watch, and his staff around him are sort of waiting for messengers and that sort of thing. The same goes for the guys down in the sort of Kiev district as well. So they're expecting that something's going to happen possibly that night, And certainly, and this feeds all the way up to the general staff in Moscow who are pleading with Stalin to put the army on a sort of military footing and to go on alert. So through the night they're starting to take steps, but it basically is too little, too late.
So as it is one of the longest days, when does the Barbarossa? When's it? Is it launched? First, I'm not sure what's first thing in the morning.
3 a.m.
3 a.m.
So they sort of timed it so that it matched the same time roughly with the light and whatever from the north to south. But effectively, it's anywhere between 3 and 3:30 a.m. depending on which bit of the front you're on.
Is that everything going at the same time? Is that the moment the Luftwaffe start driving over?
It really is hit them, full on artillery. Troops across the river, it all goes on at the same time. So it really is this cacophonous, unparalleled assault, and there's nothing like it in world history. You've got a front from the Baltic to the Black Sea literally exploding. And so the aviators who are flying over the front of the side said they've never seen anything like it when they see the muzzle flashes literally rippling along hundreds of miles of front, because obviously from their altitude they can see far greater distances, and they're just absolutely stunned by the sheer scale of it. There were certain concentrations of it, so Brest-Litovsk, or Brest as it is these days, the fortress there, that is very much the main effort for Army Group Centre. Pummel that, get across the river, bypass the fortress, and get the Panzers moving on the road to Moscow.
Is that which river is that? Is that the Bug?
Yeah, the Bug, yeah.
That must be a major obstacle. How hard is that to cross? I have visions of if you think the Allies crossing the Rhine, it's a big operation with landing craft. Have the Germans gone to that level of planning to cross the Bug, or is it a bit more Heath Robinson?
It's not as wide as the Rhine. It's a fairly substantial river. It's not particularly fast moving, like it was in 1941, because it was a late thaw, so the river's quite high. One of the reasons Barbarossa takes place when it does is partly to do with the weather and basically Europe drying out after the winter. It's also partly to do with reshuffling forces after the Balkan campaign. But certainly the Bug is a substantial obstacle, but there's no landing craft used. They use assault boats, which are effectively rubber dinghies with boats on the end, and the pioneers go across there. But there's not really any opposition. There's not there are pillboxes and things, but again, the sheer weight of the force of the bomb barrage means that most of these are stunned and knocked out fairly quickly. I think one of the divisions uses what they call Schwimm Panzer. They were sort of designed for Operation Sea Lion, so they could sort of roll ashore out of the water, a bit like our ones on D-Day, but certainly not as comprehensive as well designed. It was much more of a quickie job. They are used, but I think where they cross, they don't even need to swim, because the river's that shallow that they literally just drive straight across along the riverbed. But they sort of punch across, and really the sort of rapid advance around Brest is fascinating, because Brest itself is the kernel of resistance. It's probably the focal point for the war for that first week. If you ever get the chance to go, it's a fascinating place to go.
Well, this is the fortress had 9,000 troops garrisoned in it.
Possibly as many as 16,000. Numbers are very vague. And the strange thing is that the way the Soviets worked is they sort of all lived in the fortress with their families, or certainly the officers did. So there were homes in there as well, which were caught up in the barrage, smashed, destroyed. Families tried to escape. Quite a lot of them were murdered or killed by the barrage. The main citadel is the iconic thing with the gates that you see on a lot of sort of documentaries. That itself, it takes you probably 10, 15 minutes to walk from one side to the other. It is huge. It's a huge piece of what we call it Victorian engineering. It's sort of mid-19th century red brick, not up to the standards of warfare in 1941 by any stretch of imagination. So it can't withstand the barrages, but it's got so many vaults and hidden passageways and whatever that these turn into real sort of difficult places to eke any defenders out, and they fight like lions. And it's a story that's not really told for about until post-war, when an author sort of starts interviewing veterans. The Russians do a clever thing in the first 10 days of Barbarossa. In fact, they basically don't talk about anything that's happening at the front, because it's just calamitous, and so they focus on individual heroism. So individual deeds of bravery. The most famous ones are, they call it the Tyran, which is ramming. Sometimes a tank out of ammo that's got one chain working will sacrifice itself by ramming an entire squadron of Panzers coming towards it or something. Most of these stories are actually fake, but it doesn't really matter in the first few days. Same as in the air. Their guns are jammed. I'm going to be a nice bomber. I'll ram my plane into his tail, brings it down. So there's quite a few of these. There's quite a lot of memorials to these people, particularly Belarus. There's one near Minsk to an aviator guy. Again, they got the wrong guy because it's in the confusion of war, but they can't change it. So he's got schools and streets named after him, but that's by the by. But yeah, they focus on these individual acts of heroism rather than the specific battles to show that our glorious, brave boys are fighting, and ignore the fact that the Germans are 200 miles inside Belarus already. Brest sort of gets a bit lost in that, probably because they don't have any information. There's almost no radio contact with the outside world, so the sporadic messages into the fortress and sporadic messages out. But certainly after the sort of 23rd, 24th, there's nothing. It's cut off from the world.
Well, it's largely bypassed, but the Germans think they're going to take it in a day, but they're battering at it for days.
They basically give up after about 4 days because they realise that we might as well just besiege it and starve them to submission. They sort of contemplate all sort of horrific forms of almost medieval warfare, sort of filling moats with petrol and setting them alight, and it's truly horrendous. And then finally they drop a bomb called a Satan, I think it was called, which is the biggest bomb in the Luftwaffe's arsenal. The shockwave from that, I think it's around the 28th, 29th of June. It finally sort of teaches most of the guys who are holding out that we're not going to survive this, so they surrender en masse. But there were still people fighting in there, taking pot shots at people well into July. There's quite a few accounts from Germans talking about Brest as the Wild West, because there were so many people who were bypassed in the opening days of the campaign, and they're hiding in the woods. So they're taking pot shots at anything on the highways, trucks, etc., etc. And there's an apocryphal story of one soldier who possibly, I find it very hard to believe, but he was brought before the German commandant in sort of a beginning of 1942, having spent the entire war so far hiding in Brest Fortress. Most people generally regard the end of the fighting as sort of about a month after Barbarossa begins, but most of their stories aren't really told until a guy called Smirnov, who's a sort of journalist stroke historian, starts digging into the story about 10 years later. They start archaeological digs at the site, recover old regimental flags and that sort of thing, and that's when it starts sort of becoming a sort of a sacred place. And I'm trying to think of a comparison in Britain, but I would say it's up there with, say, Douaumont on Verdun as a place of pilgrimage. And to this day, during term times, the Belarusians schools, the sixth formers there have to do some sort of compulsory military service, so they provide the Guard of Honour at the Eternal Flame all through school terms. And it's very much a place of pilgrimage. It's where they hold their Remembrance Day, but also their Liberation Day events. But it's quite strange because it's also a place, it's almost like a sort of a huge park. So on a nice summer's day, you'll find people pushing prams around there, having cups of tea, having picnics. It's quite nice that a place that's seen such horror is now peaceful and being loved, and so it's quite moving. But it's probably the most impressive of all the Soviet memorials I've been to.
So how long does it take the Russians to grasp the extent of what's happening? Because it's such an enormous front. It occurred to me, does Moscow, when it starts getting messages back, does it understand that these are not minor border scuffles? This is a everywhere. Everywhere is under attack.
Again, not entirely. No, it sort of mentions cities being bombed in the first sort of report. Or if it realises there's a full-scale invasion, it doesn't acknowledge what's happening at the front. What I mean by that is that it's issuing orders on the end of June 22nd saying, please invade Germany. This is the Kiev military district as it becomes in the south. So they're receiving orders to strike into southern Poland to crush the Germans and get as far as, say, Lublin and places beyond that, which is, there's no relevance to the situation at the front. The guys on the staff are going, this is bonkers, but we have to do it because it's an order. So they start planning. They never actually really carry it out because the events just overtake them.
I hadn't really thought about it, but until you pointed it out to me, this 2-week period is the high watermark of how fast the Germans are moving in Russia. Did the Russians have any plans in place in case of a German invasion that they're falling back on? Or is this pace due to a complete lack of Russian ability to react because they have no idea of what to do?
They regard wars as something fought on somebody else's soil from the outset. That is their mindset. So there are defences on the Soviet-German frontier. They're pretty meagre. So if you go to, and I cannot pronounce the town's name even now, Przemyśl in southern Poland, or Przemyśl, or however you pronounce it, there's a few pillboxes still left. This, I think it's called the Molotov line or the Molotov-Stalin line. They are 4 to 6 man bunkers with a maybe a 105mm gun or maybe smaller. And there's a few of these, and that defends the front line. There's no Maginot line. There's no defence there. There's the Stalin line further to the rear, but that's really for the 1939 borders. Because obviously before...
Okay, yeah. I didn't worry if they built sort of stop lines like the British were thinking about.
Not really, no. The mindset of the Russians is, we'll invade Germany, not Germany will invade us. There's a famous film which is shown in all the Russian theatres, and there's obviously the song that goes with it. People chant at May Day parades called "If War Comes Tomorrow," but it's all about driving tanks into Berlin, and that is the mindset. So the only other line is the Stalin line, which is it's been been stripped bare by 1941 because obviously it's a couple of 100 miles behind what was the border. And again, it's not particularly well developed, so it's sort of focused around certain main nodes of either transport or cities. So there's a quite a substantial section around Minsk. If you go there, there's bits to it left now. Yeah, there are a few bunkers left, but it's not a continuous. It's sort of series of strong points. So think more Atlantic Wall, with sort of bunkers here and there, sort of interlocking fields of fire, but it's not Maginot Line. That's the front line from the 1930s. But everything else is pretty much ad hoc. Yeah, we will fight where we have to fight. So river lines are obviously the sort of main areas where they try to make a stand.
But trying to make a stand makes it sound like they're isolated pockets of small units. The Soviets have some substantial forces. Kuznetsov has 2 mechanized corps with 1,300 tanks, over 1,300 tanks. I think it's just a speed bump to the German advance.
They are quite a bit of a shock. Certainly, they're fighting in probably mostly in the southern sector and briefly in the northern sector. So I can't pronounce it because it's got too many I's in it. Razienai, which is where 2th Panzer Division runs into one of these mechanized corps, comes across T-34s and KVs, but it's like shooting a tank with a pea shooter because they find themselves horrendously outgunned, outmaneuvered, but there's no tactics. There's no thought goes into the Soviet attack. So I think, from what I remember, they throw in their tanks as soon as they arrive on the battlefield. So they don't wait to mass an entire division or entire corps. Literally, we've got 6 tanks here, right? Chuck them, send them in. There's no supporting infantry in many cases or supporting artillery, so the tanks are basically just roaming around on their own. Well, that's all well and good, but if you get behind them, you can disable them. You can Molotov cocktails in to the hatches, and the Germans, whilst they realise that they can't take these on face to face, they can knock them out. So if you take a shot at the caterpillar tracks or the wheel bearings, you will bring a KV or a T-34 to a halt. Your anti-tank guns may be insufficient, but you can disable the tank in other ways, and this is what they quickly learn. But there are some very hairy moments, both the Razienai and also in Dubno, the real one. It's basically the Kursk you've never heard of down the Ukraine, which is an utterly insane battle again because there's no coordination. They could have destroyed the Panzer army heading for Kiev, but they didn't. Whether or not it would have succeeded, I genuinely don't know. But again, it's just this uncoordinated. The pincers don't attack at the same time, so north and south. They're throwing their units piecemeal. You've got a horrendous problem whereby the Soviets have a terrible record with maintenance and spare parts. So once they have all these gleaming new tanks, nobody really knows how to maintain them. They don't have the spare parts for them. And certainly the older tanks are even worse. They basically spend the first 2 or 3 days in the southern sector of driving all around the country lanes, going this way and that, receiving conflicting orders, not engaging the enemy, but leaving maybe half their vehicles left behind on the roads because they can't maintain them. They run out of fuel, they've run out of oil, they've broken down, there's nobody to fix them, and it's utterly, it's shambolic.
I did wonder about command and control. Is it being centrally controlled by Moscow in this first 2-week period, or is it literally Johnny on the spot trying to deal with what he has while Moscow tries to get itself into gear? Or is there a big table in Moscow with people pushing around army units that they hopefully wishing that they were there?
I would say it's probably both. The army group staffs, the front staffs, as they call them in the Soviet Union, they're getting people from Moscow screaming at them, do this, do that, do that. But between the staffs and the front line, there's much less communication. Certainly, Western military district, it collapses within the first day. Pavlov, who's not a bad commander, but he's out of his depth, like most of the commanders are. I mean, we're talking about people who are probably promoted above their abilities due to the purges and everything during the late 30s. They could probably handle corps or army level stuff, but to deal with fronts of 700 miles long and several armies, it's just beyond them. Add to that the speed of the German advance and the sheer scale of the onslaught. Pavlov is on the run virtually from day one, moving out of Kiev, moving out of Minsk because Minsk comes under heavy air attack. So that immediately throws, if you don't know where the staff is, that immediately starts throwing things into disarray. His armies in the west are basically cut off by June the 29th, and in the pockets, Minsk and Bialystok pockets, command and control completely breaks down. There is no coordination whatsoever. It is literally, we must get out of this pocket at all costs. So there's no coordination. Some of the commanders shoot themselves, some of them just give up. There are a few determined ones, but it's more we're talking sort of regimental level where the real fighting's done. Most of it is brutal. There's no skill involved. There's no subterfuge. There's no trying to outflank people. It's literally charge towards it, shout hurrah, and hopefully you get through. And what you find is that the Germans, there's quite a lot of pictures of German troops lining road ditches on the edges of forests around Minsk and Bialystok, literally waiting for the onslaught to come towards them when they pick them off. Occasionally the Russians will overrun some of these outposts, and there's occasions where they're cut off for several days, but eventually the sheer fruitlessness of the trying to break out leads to the pockets disintegrating. I would say of the two, there's basically two forms. There's one around Bialystok, which today is in Poland again, just to really confuse. The tragedy of Barbarossa is a nightmare because the borders shift, something horrendous, and all the names change and possibly change again due to politics. So, trying to follow the places.
And they might have changed again from before the First World War.
Yeah. And then you've got the other one to the west of Minsk. Of the two, the western Minsk is the bigger prize. It's much larger. There's more kit in there. I think there's elements of 3 armies in it. But, and this is probably where Barbarossa, you can sort of see the Barbarossa plan starting to break down a little bit. The eastern pocket of the two is formed largely by the rapid advance of the Panzers. But to crush the pocket, you need the infantry, and the infantry are really struggling to keep up. You've got bad roads, you've got fighting, you've got the heat of summer. So for several days, the ring of encirclement is porous, to put it mildly. So how many people escape from the pocket? Nobody knows. But a lot do.
Talk about the borders there. The territories the Germans are advancing over are not all traditionally Russian. We have the Baltic states you mentioned right at the start. There's Ukraine, which, whilst had been Russian, there was a growing independence movement. I was going to say, how much were the Germans seen as liberators, and how much was this aiding the speed of the German advance? Or the Russian collapse, if you want to flip it round.
I don't know whether it aided or not. There are instances of some of the liberating, I use the word very loosely because it turns out liberation it wasn't. So there are instances of Latvians and Lithuanians and Ukrainians offering to help the Germans to do some of the carrying and load lifting for them, that sort of thing. But beyond that, not a great deal. I mean, the scenes in the first few days in places like Kaunas, Vilnius, then later on in Riga and Lvov, or Lviv as is these days, are scenes of joy for most of the population. They've been through And certainly the Baltic states, a year of hellish oppression. Literally a week before Barbarossa begins in the Baltic states, there's a mass deportation of intelligentsia and people who are perceived to be opponents of the Soviet regime, so they're all shipped off to the Gulag. So there's a widespread anger, hatred of the Soviet regime. So therefore, my enemy's enemy is my friend. The Germans are quite clever, duplicitous is probably a better word. They sort of nurture these feelings of freedom and sort of hint at, things will be better now, you're going to be free, blah, blah, blah. We'll be better times ahead. But they make it quite clear that there's no real independence for any of these nations. They'll be subservient to the Reich. It's compounded by the Untermensch. These are people of Eastern Europe. They view certain peoples more favourably than others. So they view the peoples of the Baltics probably as higher up the food chain than they do the Ukrainians, who are basically one up from a Russian. So it's one of those great lost opportunities. Had it been an international, had the Germans been a non-racial ideological force, then maybe the Soviet Union would have been toppled. I don't know, but the thing is, you can't separate Nazism from its racial ideology, and you cannot separate Barbarossa from that racial ideology, because the two are built in. It is the ultimate war of extermination from the outset. It's not just a war against the Red Army. It is a war against the Soviet peoples.
And right in saying that they had death squads as well pretty quickly behind the frontline troops.
They did. So the Einsatzgruppen had planned into this, which are SS killing squads drawn up of mainly police, stroke SS troops, stroke volunteers. They're a very strange bunch of little better than criminals in many cases. But they did horrendous things to the Einsatzgruppen. But let's not exonerate the German army, because it commits horrendous atrocities, and if it doesn't commit them, it either aids or abets them. Back in May, you have the criminal orders issued, which basically say you can kill commissars, they shall be rooted out. Jews and commissars are to be amongst prisoners, are to be rooted out immediately and singled out for special treatment. Special treatment being, if it's not execution, then it's going to be a concentration camp, but normally it's execution. Some units refuse to abide by it, and certainly a lot of the generals will protest post-war that they didn't get involved with it, but the most divisions have got blood on their hands for committing these. And these are killings that are generally committed by officers, not by the ranks. So normally certainly a commissar will probably be brought before an officer and an interrogator, and whilst he might have ordered a lonely corporal to do the actual killing, it's definitely the officers who are making the decisions and bumping them off. But aside from that, it's not just commissars and the sort of political leaders and the Jews. It's basically everybody. Any crime committed or perceived crime committed against the Germans as they invade is given carte blanche to when it comes to a response. So hostage taking, around burning down villages, no qualms whatsoever. Probably less so in the first few days of Barbarossa than further on in the campaign. There's basically a wave of destruction which moves across Eastern Europe with the German army in 1941. And what takes it to the next level, for want of a better phrase, is that civilians of the liberated peoples join in. And that's what, for me, makes this first fall at Barbarossa unparalleled in warfare. It's that speed of advance and brutality of modern warfare, coupled with what I can only describe as medieval pogroms.
It's bubbling away in the internal population of these local countries, and now often gets overlooked because conveniently you can blame it on the Germans. But
and that's what they do to this day. There's the general reluctance among these peoples to say that yes, our ancestors were involved. There were some places where they do acknowledge it. So there's a fort in Kaunas in Lithuania, which is where a lot of the atrocities took place in 1941 in June, where they rounded up the local Jewish population and literally killed them in either by shooting or by throwing grenades into them. It's an absolute bloodbath. But it's one place where, in restoring the fort post the end of the Soviet Union, turned into a museum, stroke, I think an education centre as well. They made a point of making sure that they remember the victims, and they made a point of making sure that they remember that the victims were killed by Lithuanians, not by Germans. Certainly, most of the killings in Kaunas are done by Lithuanians. So the most brutal one is a guy called he was given the nickname of the Death Dealer of Kaunas. He basically has this huge wooden club, and he's standing on the forecourt of a garage, which is used by the local cooperative society, or was pre-war. There's a cordon of people surrounding the courtyard, watching what's going on, and in the middle there are bodies lying on the floor, and there's blood flowing into the gutters, and literally the Jews are thrown into this pit, for want of a better word, and he beats them to death. There's no trial. There's no justice whatsoever. It literally is, here's a Jew, send him into the lion's den. This chap bludgeons them to death, and he's proud about it. He's pictured doing it. The pictures, they exist to this day. There are horrific scenes, certainly described by some of the Germans who watched, who didn't intervene, so they didn't stop what was going on. Even they were appalled by what was going on, but they described it as people singing, chanting, bringing their kids, lifting them up on their shoulders to watch. Somebody's playing the accordion, somebody's singing the national anthems. And the other thing is, are these accounts true? A lot of the accounts are taken from the Wehrmacht's War Crimes Investigation Unit, which is a bit of an ironic title considering how many are committed. But you see, these are crimes committed against the Wehrmacht. But what they also include are a lot of crimes committed by the NKVD. So from around June the 24th onwards, NKVD headquarters, which is Beria, basically up in Moscow, says empty the prisons, transfer everybody west. The Germans are coming, leave no man behind. Now, the speed of the advance means that in many cases they don't have the time to do the evacuation. I think in some cases they probably could have done it, but they chose not to. So their solution is kill everybody. So every prison, particularly in the western Ukraine, is just a charnel house whereby people aren't just murdered, they are tortured to death. The reason why I say I wonder whether these stories are true is because some of the descriptions are, you couldn't make them up. So there's certainly plenty of descriptions of crucifixion, of people being buried alive, of people being walled up in cellars. That I can certainly believe that happened. Some of the other ones are probably a little more grandiose, but again, it would take a really vivid imagination to think of these things in the first place.
These are Russian reports of what happened to their own people.
So these are German, after the sort of initial fighting went through, they principally investigated what happened to any German soldier that fell into Soviet hands. A lot of these would be aviators in the first days because obviously they were flying ahead of the force and got shot down. But in the course of the investigations, they also interviewed people who were witness to these other atrocities because, or certainly some of the people, the Germans who were captured, were taken to NKVD prisons. There were the three main ones in Lvov, for example, which is where the worst atrocities took place and recounted in the book. A few weeks later, the Germans interviewed those who were there, and these are interviews generally conducted by doctors, surgeons. They run for page after page, and I certainly remember the document being brought out to me when I was in Freiburg doing the research, and it was a beautiful summer's day like today, scorching day, windows are wide open. Normally, you just sort of type automatically, robotically, and you don't really read the words, and it goes from page to screen. And for some reason, my brain started translating these accounts. And I'm literally sitting there in the room with sort of turning white and going, what the hell am I doing? What is this? I've never read anything quite so grim as this.
Richard, we're going to take a pause there, folks. We'll be back in a moment. That first couple of weeks, it is the Germans have advanced hundreds of miles. Why does it start to slow?
Various reasons. I would say one is the mobilisation of the Red Army, and it keeps throwing people into the mix very, very quickly. Not necessarily successfully, but if there's people there to kill that you have to kill, then you've got to kill them, and it takes time. So that slows down the sheer numbers being thrown against. Franz Holder writes on July the 3rd, which is where the sort of books effectively ends. We've won the war. We've destroyed the bulk of the Red Army in the West, blah, blah, blah. Everything's jolly good. We just got good sort of clean things up for the next 3 weeks and then we'll all be sorted. But that isn't the case. They barely started. They're barely into Russia. And yet all the problems that they're going to face for the rest of the next 4 years are all there. So they've suffered heavy losses. Nothing by comparison to what they suffered later in the war, but far heavier than anything they've suffered to date. So, I mean, some of the divisions involved in the clearing up the mince pockets, they lose more people in 2 days than they lost in France. There's that sort of scale of defeat. There's the wear and tear on the vehicles. Just in 2 weeks into the campaign, a lot of the units are down to a handful of Panzers left. They need to regroup, they need to catch up. And similarly, the infantry is struggling to keep pace with the advance. There are men who are utterly exhausted, and July the 3rd, you're literally 200 miles into Russia. There's still 600 miles to Moscow, however many miles up to Leningrad and Kiev and beyond, with no evidence that the Russians are going to give up yet. There's no sign of any surrender or the rhetoric out of Moscow. And the July 3rd speech by Stalin is very much a rallying call. That is the Great Patriotic War. That's the moment where he sort of...
This is when Stalin finally speaks after, is it 11 days? It's incredible long time he doesn't say anything.
It is. I mean, there's quite a lot of misnomer about Stalin in the opening days of Barbarossa. He doesn't suffer a nervous breakdown. Or if he does, then it's right at the end of the first week. It's not the moment the Germans invade. So for the first 5 or 6 days, he keeps up a blistering pace of work in the Kremlin.
But he says nothing to the Soviet people.
He says nothing to the people. So certainly on June 22nd, he sends Molotov to do his dirty work. He writes most of the speech and he puts the bit at the end about Germans were defeated, etc., etc. But he makes Molotov deliver it. I mean, to be honest, neither of them are good orators. Molotov's slightly worse than Stalin, but most people would have expected to have heard Stalin on that day. There are letters and documents in the Soviet/Russian archives from people complaining in those first 10 days. They're not saying that Stalin's a coward, they just want to hear his voice as a sort of a soothing, reassuring voice, which is why the address on July 3rd is so famous. It's also the tone he uses, because he talks about his comrades and fellow citizens, and Stalinism is all about the little people being the little people and basically just pawns, whereas he actually addresses them as human beings for once. It's probably about the only time he does. But so that is his re-emergence. So his mental breakdown is it's about the time that Minsk falls, and he just can't believe that the Russians have lost so much ground so quickly. He basically just sort of crawls into his shell, disappears to his dacha outside Moscow, and stays there for a couple of days. When the party leaders go to visit him, he's expecting to be arrested. He's thinking, I've screwed up royally. I think Lenin left us a great legacy. Now we've effed it up. Is I think one of his phrases. He's sort of sitting there, pretty much forlorn, expected to be put on trial as a traitor to people, etc., etc. What he's done over in the decade before is so ripped the guts out of his party. There's nobody to lead. There's nobody who would have the trust of the Soviet people in 1941 other than Stalin. The only people who have anywhere near his sort of prestige and reputation are probably some of the generals, but they're not going to lead because they're fighting the war. So they basically they go cap in hand to Stalin's dacha and they say, "Please lead us. We're so useless. We can't cope with this. We need you to take charge, take the reins, and to sort of rally the country." And that's really where he sort of bounces back.
And it's funny because that point, that it's almost 2 weeks, and that's the point where he gives the speech, and that's the point where the German advance starts to slow.
Well, whether the two are linked, probably unlikely, but yeah, I mean, the other part of the German advance is the drive to Leningrad, which goes off at terrific pace. The first German panzers are on the river. It's got various names: Daugava in Latvian, Duna in German, Dvina in Russian, and it reaches a place called Dunaburg, which the Germans call it, and Daugava Pills in Latvian, which is about 80 to 100 miles from Riga. And although a lot of the focus is on Riga as the capital and it's a big city, etc., etc., the real battle for Leningrad is I think won and lost on the Dvina here, because the Panzers cross the bridge by the Brandenburgers, who are basically the SAS of the German armed forces. They storm across the river. We have this armoured spearhead that's just got its foothold on the right bank of the Daugava, poised to strike it into Russia. There's not a great deal there stopping it. The Russians are still sort of mobilising their forces behind the river. But the lunge is so drawn out by the Germans from the Lithuanian-Latvian borders that the commander, Herpner, decides that, no, we've got to regroup. We've got to get all our forces across. We've got to be strong enough to punch forward. Manstein, who's leading the Panzer Corps, all for pressing on. He's all for, no, let's not hang around. Let's keep on pushing, driving further and further. Who's right? It's one of those what-ifs of history. Some people think that Manstein was right. If he'd have pushed on, he probably would have got to Leningrad, maybe. But it would have been a pretty weak force, pretty drawn out and easily pick-offable, for want of a better phrase. Herpner is more old school, but when he actually is ready to unleash his attack on Leningrad or continue to drive towards it, the pace is, we're talking a few miles a day rather than 20, 30, 40 miles a day. So those few days are enough for the Russians to catch their breath, to build up their forces, to launch a couple of counterattacks. And this happens time and again where, and this is something that comes in my next book as well, whereby it's almost like everything the Germans do is they get some of their last breath, but they haven't got quite enough strength to carry it through to fruition. Yeah, so all the way to the gates of Moscow back in December, they reach out to go to Moscow, but we just can't keep any further. What they never do is they don't say, oh, we'll wait here, we'll build up off, we'll sort of wait here and get a bit of strength together. But it's always, we'll keep on pushing, and we end up extending our lines and they collapse.
Well, that's perhaps because if they think, well, look at the size of Russia, if we wait here, what they're going to have in 6 months. They fight wars that are over in months. They don't play a long game because they can't support that long game.
And so certainly by the end of July, so on Monday to Barbarossa, the general staff has realised that Barbarossa itself has failed, and we're going to have to come up with some other plan to beat Russia, and they never really do. It's basically just keep on advancing further and further into the Soviet Union, keep on having crushing victories, but it's victories without victory. You talk about Smolensk, and then you go to the Bryansk pocket, the Kiev pocket, which is on a scale is just utterly insane. It's 600,000-700,000 people, but again, it doesn't bring the war to any conclusion.
Well, as we move beyond the first couple of weeks of the invasion, that seems like a good place to finish. Thank you, Richard. Loyal listener, if you'd like to read more, Richard's book is Opening the Gates of Hell, the Eastern Front Barbarossa. It is out now and offers a gripping account of those early weeks of the campaign and the chaos that followed. Now, if you've enjoyed this podcast and would like to support the show, you can do so by becoming a patron. Just head to patreon.com/WW2 Podcast. It's the support of listeners like you that help me keep the show going. Patrons get access to extra content, more World War II chat, and you'll also get all episodes completely ad-free. So that's patreon.com/WW2 Podcast if you'd like to join and help support what I do. So that is all for this episode. I'm Angus Wallace, and thanks for listening.
Jerry 88mm gun hit our town and blew us the hell out of it.
Stalingrad can never be repaired.
As Allied Commander-in-Chief, I have granted a military armistice.